Hey, welcome to Crossroads. You might have seen the recent headlines where, of course, solar flares were threatening the American electric grid. You might have also looked at the sky and saw the auroras, something very unusual, and wondered, well, how real is this threat? How much of a serious threat would it be if the electric grid were to go down in the United States? And of course, this goes on the heels of other news articles talking about foreign countries planning and, of course, working on possible attacks on our electric grid, and even terrorist groups and just activist organizations targeting electrical stations. It seems that the American electric grid has become a target, and people may wonder, well, how much of a threat is this? Why should we care? And is this all just a big scare tactic? Well, here to talk with us about this is Tommy Waller. He's president and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. Hey, Tommy Waller, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Hey, thank you for having me on. It's an honor, Joshua.
So, Tommy, I think for a long time, a lot of people in the security industry, they've been talking about threats to critical infrastructure. And, a big part of that has been, what happens if the electric grid goes down? Only recently, I think, has this gotten kind of broader attention. But, I want to get into some of what we see in the solar flares and the attacks and so on like that. But just broadly speaking, what happens if America's electric grid goes down? Like, why is this such a threat?
Yeah, Joshua, you're right. It has absolutely been a prime issue, at least for our nonprofit, Center for Security Policy, for nearly 2 decades. We recognize that grid security is national security, right? Think about all the critical national security functions that depend on electricity, including our military bases. More than 90% of our military bases are completely dependent upon the civilian electric grid. But so is everybody else, right? So if your viewers and listeners think right now, what would life be like without electricity? And you just extend that duration, and the longer that duration goes, the more catastrophic it would be like if we lost it.
Well, some of the reports I've seen were, for example, Republicans talking about the, deaths that would happen in America if the grid went down within about like a 90-day tier. I know that some of the data they used is from like a science fiction novel, and some people write it off. What would the actual projected impact be, maybe within a year or so, if the grid did go down in America?
Yeah, so Joshua, I'm glad you brought up the term science fiction, because it's actually not science fiction, it's science fact. And what happened, I think what you were referring to is actually a really good book, 1 Second After, by Dr. William Forstchen. And in fact, what he did is he wrote a fictional story, right? So it's fiction, about a nonfiction possibility, which is the grid going down. And in that case, due to a nuclear electromagnetic pulse. And to answer your question, Joshua, the Congressional EMP Commission, which was bipartisan, there were members from both political parties. It's not political, it's not partisan. What they predicted was that within the first year without electric power, the United States would lose 90% of its population. But the interesting part about that statistic, Joshua, is that they just looked at what the North American landmass could sustain in terms of a human population before electricity. And that number was roughly 30 million. And so all they really did was look at, okay, well, if we didn't have electricity prior to electricity and we had 30 million people, then that's probably what we would have afterwards. And unfortunately, Joshua, I think it could be much worse, because the difference is today, most people don't know how to live without electricity. So it could, in fact, be way worse than 90% of our population.
Yeah, some people might question, why not just replace it? I understand there are some key parts with the electric grid, like the transformers and so on. If it did go down, couldn't they just replace it? What do you tell people?
Yeah, so the long-term fix is that we figure out a way to get off of the current vulnerable grid. So if you thought about like microgrids that were resilient to all hazards all throughout the country, that's the long-term vision. But to your question about, well, can't you just replace the parts, right? If they break, it's not that easy. Especially, you mentioned, Joshua, transformers. The lead time for the transformers, these big, people can see them when they drive down the road. You look at these substations, you see these big transformers. The largest of those, the lead time is now 4 to 6 years. And when the Congressional EMP Commission did the study they did and looked at it, the lead time back then was more like 12 to 18 months. So the demand for these parts has significantly increased. Worldwide, they've been targeted, right? Russia is destroying electrical assets in Ukraine like crazy. And then you've got situations like China, who have captured, through economic warfare, the production means for so many of these things so that they can hold us hostage if they want to.
Hmm. You know, I mean, you talked about Russia, China, and I think that ties into modern military warfare in general, where, you know, you look at the soft spots behind military power. And, you know, part of the thinking I know with Chinese unrestricted warfare, and they get into the Assassin's Maze program, countries that look to fight America, they know they can't take our military head on, and so they look at the soft spots. They look at our satellites. They look at the things that create the military advantage we have, and they look at how to disable those.
That's absolutely right.
So when it comes to, of course, military operations that would target the electric grid or electrical infrastructure, like, what does this actually look like? What are we seeing from actual tangible threats from other countries?
Yeah, so rewind the clock in terms of China, right? Rewind the clock a few thousand years. And Sun Tzu, who said the supreme art of war is to subdue your enemy without fighting. That's exactly how our adversaries can do it. You mentioned unrestricted warfare. You know, if your listeners, viewers go and just type it in, unrestricted warfare PDF into Google, you'll find the translation. You go to page 144 and you read 4 pages of that. And you think about what we experience today. You look at director Christopher Wray's warnings when he says there's red lights flashing like crazy. Volt Typhoon is in our networks. They said this decades ago in their warfighting doctrine. So again, this is not science fiction. It's not fantasy. It is implicit to the doctrine. And that's just China. We could go, if we had time, and I could go through all the other examples from the Islamic Republic of Iran to Russia to North Korea. Every single state-level adversary, and even terrorist groups, Joshua, target the grid. It happened in Mexico with the drug cartels there, and in Pakistan with the Islamic terrorists there.
Yeah. So in other words, this is something that they're thinking about. In other words, this is not some frontier thing. This is kind of commonly known military target or terrorist target. Then, right?
That's right. Yeah, Joshua. Look, the United States military, we do the same thing. You know, you think about Desert Storm. There were certain types of munitions that were used. In fact, prior to that invasion, there were some discussion about the use of nuclear EMP. That didn't, of course, happen, but they used specific munitions that targeted substations, electric substations, in such a way that would take down the Iraqi grid. This is basic warfighting. If there's a critical infrastructure that your enemy depends on and you can take it out, again, rewind the clock all the way to the Roman Empire, right? What did the Mongols do? They pushed over the aquifers that supplied water to the city of Rome. Attacking critical infrastructure is as basic as it gets to humans fighting each other. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, actually, I think you made a great example of this with the original Gulf War, right? The original war in Iraq, where America, you know, one of the reasons why the war was over so quickly, which was really seen as such a massive victory of the United States. And people maybe even forgot that we even did that because it was over so fast. And again, basically under Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi military was seen as one of the more powerful militaries there was at the time. And America, you know, what we did was we took out their communication systems. We took up their communication systems, and you had entire battalions surrendering to the United States. I mean, what message do you think that sent, and what is understood from that example among these countries on the importance of advanced technology for military and what it means if you just eliminate those capabilities?
Yeah, Joshua, it's interesting that you mentioned that example because that's exactly what inspired the 2 People's Liberation Army colonels that wrote Unrestricted Warfare. If you read that book, the very first part of it is an entire analysis of that war. And what they recognized was that the military supremacy of the United States could only be defeated through this new concept of unrestricted warfare, targeting every other aspect of American civilization and building up their military capabilities during that, you know, that long march, right? And that's what's been so inspiring about your network. Epoch Times has consistently covered every single aspect of Chinese economic warfare against the United States and against the rest of the free world. So it's a privilege to be able to talk to you about this.
I appreciate it. You know, on that note, though, we've been seeing a lot of weird news on the periphery. Like, I mean, I've been trying to kind of keep track of it and I've been trying to figure out what's going on, frankly. We've been seeing reports from different government agencies saying that the American grid is under attack. They're seeing cyber attacks. They're seeing examples of what look like foreign agents probing the network for vulnerabilities, maybe even building like things they could put in place and then activate later, like logic bomb type stuff. They're putting in these, they're probing it, finding vulnerabilities, and then maintaining access to those vulnerabilities. And I understand that there's some concerns that if a war were to take place, that those assets are already there and they could just flip it one day and take the whole thing down. I mean, is this far-fetched? Like, how realistic is this?
Yeah, it's not far-fetched at all. Think about, so let's start with physical sabotage, right? So we know right now, we pull the data. Every time the Department of Energy uploads it, our nonprofit pulls down the data. You're looking at more than 1,039 physical attacks on grid infrastructure over the last 10 years. When you do the math on that, that's more than 1.5 per week. And this is coming from left, right, center, you name it. There's not any one ideological group, even though you'll see narratives out there that say it's one certain group. The bottom line is that the grid is vulnerable. Even sometimes it's just vandalism. We saw what happened in Moore County, North Carolina, December 2 years ago, where people lost power instantly with no notice because 2 electric substations were physically attacked. But to your point, Joshua, it's not just physical sabotage, it's cyber attack. Utilities are constantly being probed and attacked via the cyber domain. But it gets worse than that. The supply chain, right? China makes many of our transformers right now. We know for a fact that one of those transformers was found to have hardware backdoors in it that could allow them to remotely shut it off. And that's what precipitated the Trump administration passing an executive order May 1st, 2020, in order to secure our bulk power system. Unfortunately, on the first day of the Biden administration, that executive order was suspended. The floodgates were reopened to the importation of Chinese transformers. And as of last month, we now have 449 Chinese transformers in the grid. Who knows how many of those could be remotely shut off?